The ship was enormous. It moved through space like a needle through black silk, silent and sharp, carrying inside it one very uncomfortable human being. Cale Rourke stood at the wide viewport of his private cabin and stared out at the stars. They looked the same out here as they did from Earth. Same cold lights, same endless dark, but everything else was different. The air smelled faintly of something like flowers and metal. The walls were curved and smooth, carved from a material that humans had not yet figured out how to make. The floor had a faint glow to it, like the ship was alive and breathing beneath his boots. He hated formal clothes. That was the first thing he thought when he looked down at himself. The suit they had given him was white and silver, with a high collar and buttons made of something that was not quite pearl and not quite stone. It had been made by a Velthari tailor who had clearly never put a measuring tape on a human body before. The sleeves were slightly too long. The shoulders were slightly too wide. It made him look, he thought, like a child wearing his father's jacket. He was 34 years old. He had survived 12 years of war. He had crawled through the wreckage of burning colony ships and carried wounded soldiers across 3 kilometers of open ground under fire. He had done things that he did not talk about at dinner tables. And now he was standing in an ill-fitting suit, on an alien ship, about to marry a princess he had never met. The peace treaty had been his government's idea. Both sides had bled enough. The Velthari sovereignty and the Terran Confederacy had been tearing each other apart for over a decade, and the stars between their two civilizations were littered with the wreckage of ships and the frozen bodies of soldiers. Someone had finally sat down and counted the cost. Someone had finally said, "Enough." The treaty had many clauses, trade routes, shared space lanes, border agreements, and then buried near the end, one final clause that had caused more argument in the Terran Senate than all the others combined. A marriage. A human representative, a soldier of distinguished service, would be given in marriage to a member of the Velthari royal family, a gesture of permanent union, a symbol that could not be undone with a signature or a handshake. Cale had not volunteered. He had been selected. His commanding officer had told him it was an honor. His commanding officer had not looked him in the eye when he said it. He picked up the small photograph he kept in his breast pocket. It was old and slightly creased. It showed a group of soldiers standing in front of a broken gate on a colony world called Meridian Station. They were all grinning. Most of them were dead now. He looked at their faces for a moment, then put the photo back. He could do this. He would do this. The door to his cabin opened without a knock. A Velthari attendant stepped in, tall, silver-skinned, with large violet eyes and white hair pulled back tight. The Velthari were beautiful in the way that glaciers were beautiful, cold, perfect, and very large. "The betrothal gathering begins in 1 hour," the attendant said. His voice was smooth and slightly musical, the way all Velthari speech sounded. "You are expected to present yourself to the court." "I'll be there," Cale said. The attendant looked at his suit for a moment without expression, then left. Cale took a slow breath and turned back to the stars. The gathering hall was the largest room on the ship. It ran the full length of the upper deck, with a ceiling so high that the lights near the top looked like distant stars. Crystal columns lined the walls. A soft, strange music played from somewhere, not instruments that Cale recognized, but the sound was not unpleasant. Long tables were set with food and drink, and the hall was already full when Cale arrived. There were perhaps 300 Velthari nobles in the room. They were all dressed in colors that seemed to shift when the light moved, deep blues and greens and golds that had no exact human equivalent, jewelry that glowed softly at wrists and throats, hair braided and pinned with thin silver wire. They stood in clusters, speaking in low voices, and when Cale entered, the conversations did not stop. They simply changed tone. He could not understand everything they said. His translation earpiece caught most of it, but some words had no human equivalent. What he could understand was enough. "That is the human. Shorter than I expected. They all look like that, like something unfinished. He smells strange." He walked through the hall with his hands loose at his sides and his expression calm. He had learned long ago that letting people see your anger only gave them more power over you. He nodded politely to the nobles who met his eyes. Most looked away. Some did not bother to pretend they were not staring. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform with 2 long steps leading up to it, sat Princess Saravale on Valdris. She was exactly as the diplomatic briefings had described, tall even for a Velthari, with silver skin that had a faint blue undertone, and eyes the color of deep ocean water. Her hair was white and fell in a single thick braid over one shoulder, threaded with something that caught the light like woven starlight. Her expression was composed and perfectly neutral, and she looked at Kale when he approached the platform with the same expression she might have used to look at a piece of furniture she had not ordered. He bowed. The protocol team had drilled him on the correct depth and angle. He got it right. She inclined her head, barely. Before he could say anything, a voice came from his left. "Remarkable it bows." Laughter moved through the nearest cluster of nobles. Kale turned his head. The man who had spoken was standing with a group of 4 others, tall even among the Velthari, dressed in deep red robes with a silver sigil on his chest that Kale's briefing notes identified as the mark of House Vor. Lord Dreven, the man who had expected to marry the princess before a human soldier, had taken his place in the treaty. Dreven looked at Kale with the calm, unhurried amusement of someone who had never been hit in his life, and did not believe he ever would be. "Tell me," Dreven said, loud enough for the surrounding nobles to hear clearly, "does your species understand the significance of this ceremony? Or do you simply follow where you are pointed?" More laughter, quiet, polished, and sharp. Kale looked at Dreven for a moment. He thought about several responses. He chose the simplest one. "I understand it well enough," he said. Dreven smiled. It was not a kind smile. A short answer, fitting, I suppose, for a short life. He raised his glass toward the princess in a small, theatrical gesture. "The sovereignty opens its arms to the mayfly groom." The hall rippled with laughter again. The princess said nothing. A muscle in her jaw moved just once, but her expression did not change. Kale stood in the center of that laughter and let it fall around him like rain. He thought about Meridian Station. He thought about the clause at the end of the treaty. He thought about the faces in the photograph. He stayed, he smiled thin and quiet. And he waited. Valdris Prime was the kind of world that made a person feel small in a way that had nothing to do with size. The planet's surface was covered in forests of crystal-threaded trees that grew hundreds of meters tall, their branches spreading out like the arms of sleeping giants. Between the trees, rivers ran in colors that shifted from deep blue to soft green depending on the hour. The sky was pale gold during the day and deep violet at night, and 2 small moons hung low enough that on clear evenings you felt like you could almost reach up and touch them. Kale stood on the landing platform and looked at all of it and thought, quietly, that it was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He was not given long to think about it. The pre-wedding ceremonies had begun almost immediately after the ship landed, and they showed no signs of stopping. There were 7 distinct rituals before the wedding itself, each one ancient, each one involving specific clothing, specific postures, specific words that had to be spoken in a particular order. The protocol team had prepared Kale as well as they could, but the sheer volume of it was staggering. He spent his mornings being dressed by attendants who adjusted his robes with the focused intensity of people defusing a bomb, and his afternoons standing in the correct positions while priests spoke words over him in Old Velthari, which no one had bothered to translate for him. The nobles watched every ceremony with careful eyes. When Kale stumbled over a word, they murmured. When he held a ritual object at the wrong angle, they murmured louder. None of it was directed at him openly. They had the social instincts of people who had been practicing cruelty for thousands of years and had learned to keep the sharpest edges hidden. But his earpiece caught enough. Little comments. Small comparisons, observations about how a creature with such a short lifespan could possibly be expected to understand what these rituals meant. He understood more than they gave him credit for. He was good at reading rooms. 12 years in the military taught you that, if nothing else. On the third day of the ceremonies, Lord Dreven appeared with an offer. He came in the early morning before the day's first ritual, while Kale was drinking coffee from a flask he had brought from Earth, because the Vilthari did not have coffee, and he was not willing to function without it. Dreven was accompanied by two of his usual companions, and he was smiling the way he always smiled, pleasantly, and with the warmth of a closed window. The afternoon schedule includes a ceremonial hunt, Dreven said, a tradition of the court. You are, of course, welcome to join. It would show good faith to the nobles, demonstrate that you are willing to engage with our customs. Kale looked at him over the rim of the flask. What do you hunt? The forests around the capital are home to many creatures. The hunt is guided, of course, perfectly safe. Dreven's smile did not move, for experienced participants. Kale agreed, not because he trusted Dreven. He had stopped trusting people who smiled like that somewhere around his second year of active service. He agreed because refusing would have been read as weakness, and because he wanted to see what Dreven was planning. The hunt began well enough. 40 nobles on sleek hover platforms moved through the outer edge of the crystal forest, following a guide who tracked something large and fast through the undergrowth. The light came through the trees in long, shifting shafts of pale gold, and the forest floor was covered in something like moss that made no sound underfoot. It was genuinely beautiful. Then the guide said something quietly to Dreven, who nodded, and the group split. Kale found himself directed, with two other nobles and no guide, toward a section of forest that felt immediately different. The trees grew closer together here. The undergrowth was denser. The sounds changed, less birdsong, more of a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. The other two nobles dropped back slowly, then disappeared entirely. Kale stopped walking. He looked around. He took a slow breath. Something moved in the trees to his left, large, low to the ground, fast. He did not panic. He had learned early that panic killed people slower than bullets did, because at least bullets were quick. He assessed. The creature that came out of the undergrowth was roughly the size of a large bear, six-legged, with a flat, wide head and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. It was clearly a predator. It was clearly not part of a guided hunt. It was looking at him with the focused, patient attention of something that had found its meal and was deciding when to begin. He did not have a weapon. They had not given him one. Protocol, they had said. Ceremonial hunts did not require weapons for observers. He picked up the heaviest thing within arm's reach, a fallen branch, dense and roughly a meter long, and he thought fast. He had spent years reading terrain. He identified the narrowest gap between two trees, moved toward it, and waited for the creature to commit to its charge. When it came, he stepped sideways instead of back, hit it hard across the flat of its skull with the branch, and ran. He ran fast and he ran smart, making for the sound of voices in the distance. The creature followed for perhaps 200 meters, then fell back. He broke out of the dense section of forest into a clearing where the rest of the hunting party had gathered. He was breathing hard. His sleeve was torn. He had a shallow cut on his forearm where a branch had caught him. Dreven was already there. His expression showed exactly the right amount of surprise and concern, and none of it was real. "You were separated," Dreven said, stepping forward. "How fortunate that you found your way back. That section of forest is quite dangerous. We would have sent a search party." The surrounding nobles murmured. One of them said something quietly and several others laughed. Kale caught the edge of it in his earpiece, wandered into the deep woods, like a child, had to be recovered. He said nothing. He handed the broken branch to a nearby attendant as though it were a perfectly normal thing to be carrying and walked back toward the platforms. He kept his face calm and his eyes forward and his hands very still. That evening, there was a knock at his door. He opened it and found the princess standing in the corridor. She was alone, which surprised him. She was dressed simply compared to the ceremonies, a long robe of deep silver blue, her hair unbraided and falling loose around her shoulders. She looked younger without the formal weight of the court around her. Not softer, just younger. She stepped inside without being invited, looked at the small cabin, at the flask of coffee on the table, at the torn sleeve he had not yet changed, and sat down in the single chair without asking if she could. "You knew," she said. "It was not a question." "That it was a setup, yes," he said. "And you went anyway." Saying no would have been worse. She looked at him for a long moment with those deep ocean eyes. "You handled it." "Barely," he said honestly. Something shifted slightly in her expression. She had not expected honesty. "I did not arrange this marriage," she said. "I want you to understand that. I was told as you were told. I did not choose it." "I know," he said. "I didn't either." "Then you understand when I tell you that I have no warmth to offer you. I will perform the ceremonies. I will fulfill the terms of the treaty. But do not arrive expecting a welcome that I cannot give." He looked at her for a moment. She was prepared for anger, he could see that, or for wounded pride. She was not prepared for what he said. "I didn't come here for warmth, Your Highness." He picked up the photograph from the table and set it down in front of her without explanation. "I came here so that the kids on both our sides stop dying in a war they had no part in starting. That's the only reason I'm here. I don't need you to like me." She looked at the photograph for a long time, at the grinning soldiers, at the broken gate behind them, at the youth in all their faces. When she looked up, she did not say anything, but she looked at him differently than she had before, not with warmth, not yet, with something more careful and more honest than warmth. She stood and left without another word. Cale sat alone in the small cabin with his coffee going cold and the stars moving slowly past the viewport, and thought that maybe, just maybe, this was not entirely impossible. The spire of eternal houses had stood for 10,000 years. That was the first thing the protocol team told Cale when they briefed him on the wedding venue. 10,000 years. The building predated the Velthari's first contact with any other species. It predated their space travel. It predated almost everything that humans considered ancient. Its walls had been grown rather than built, shaped from a living stone that the Velthari cultivated over centuries, and the result was something that looked less like a structure and more like a natural formation. Vast arching columns and curved ceilings and floors that were perfectly smooth and slightly warm underfoot, as though the stone itself still held the memory of sunlight. Thousands of nobles had gathered from across the sovereignty. They filled the gallery levels that rose above the main floor in rings, each level slightly higher than the last, so that the whole room curved upward like the inside of a shell. The colors of 100 noble houses rippled through the crowd. Light came in through narrow windows set high in the walls, falling in long, clean columns across the floor below. Cale stood at the entrance to the main hall and looked at all of it and felt, for just a moment, the full weight of what he had walked into. He was one human being, in a room built 10,000 years before his species had learned to write, surrounded by nobles who thought his entire civilization was a temporary inconvenience, about to bind himself permanently to a princess who had told him plainly she could offer him no warmth. He took a breath. He walked in. The first day of the wedding ceremony passed without incident. It was mostly music and spoken ritual, long passages in Old Velthari that the priests delivered in slow, rolling cadences, punctuated by moments where Cale was required to stand, kneel, speak a phrase, or hold a specific object. He had practiced every step. He made no visible mistakes. The nobles in the galleries watched in silence that was not quite respectful and not quite hostile, but something carefully neutral in between. The princess moved through it all with the flawless precision of someone who had been trained from birth for moments exactly like this. She did not look at Kale often. When she did, her expression gave nothing away. The second day began differently. The rite of binding oaths was the oldest part of the ceremony, the section of the wedding that had the most legal weight, the most spiritual significance, and the most witnesses. Every noble in the room was standing for it. The main floor was clear except for the princess, the senior priest, and Kale, with the Terran diplomatic envoy watching from a dedicated section of the first gallery with expressions that ranged from carefully hopeful to visibly anxious. The priest had just begun the opening passage of the rite when a voice spoke from the gathered nobles. "I invoke the right of contested worth." The hall went quiet so completely, and so fast that it felt like the air had been pulled out of it. Kale did not know that phrase, but he could feel, from the way every person in the room reacted, the stiffening of postures, the sharp intake of breath, the way the priest stopped speaking mid-word, that something significant had just happened. Lord Dreven stepped forward from his place in the gathered nobles. He was dressed in deep red again, standing straight, his voice carrying across the hall without effort. He looked like a man who had been waiting a long time for this moment and had enjoyed the wait. "The right of contested worth is ancient law," Dreven said, loudly enough for the galleries to hear clearly. "It holds that any noble of standing may challenge the worthiness of a proposed groom before the binding oaths are completed. The challenge must be met before the ceremony continues." He turned and looked at Kale directly for the first time. There was something satisfied in his face. It cannot be refused without the challenged party forfeiting his place in the treaty. The Terran envoy had gone pale in the gallery above. Kale understood now. He understood the whole of it, the mocking at the gathering, the hunt in the dangerous forest, all of it building toward this. Dreven had not been trying to humiliate him for sport. He had been testing him, probing for a crack, looking for the moment when Kale would show enough weakness that this public challenge would feel guaranteed. If Kale refused the right, the treaty clause collapsed. The peace collapsed with it. And Dreven would be the man who had defended Vilthari honor from an unworthy outsider. The priest looked at Kale. The princess looked at Kale. The entire hall looked at Kale. He could feel the weight of it. 300 years of war waiting on the other side of this moment. Colonies that would burn. Soldiers who would die. Families that would receive the kind of message that no one ever wanted to open. "What does the right require?" Kale asked. His voice was level. The priest answered quietly. "Single combat before the court, first to yield or fall." A pause. "The challenged party may choose the terms of engagement." Dreven smiled. He was very tall, very fast, centuries old, and trained in every form of Vilthari combat. Whatever terms Kale chose, Dreven had already calculated that he would win them. Kale thought for exactly 4 seconds. "I accept," he said. The hall did not erupt into noise. It did something stranger. It went even quieter, as if the room had stopped breathing. Dreven's smile did not falter, but something behind it changed slightly. He had not expected that answer to come so fast or so calmly. The senior priest raised his hands. "The court witnesses the acceptance. The right of contested worth will proceed. Both parties will take the floor." He looked at Kale. "You may call for a weapon." Kale reached into the inner fold of his ceremonial robe and drew his own. It was a combat knife, not ceremonial, not ornate. Matte black from handle to tip, the blade scratched from use, the grip wrapped in cord that had been replaced so many times it had worn smooth. It was the knife he had carried through the war. It was the knife he had kept through 12 years because it had never failed him yet. He had asked permission to keep it on his person during the wedding. The protocol team had agreed because they thought it was a sentimental object, a cultural accessory, something decorative. He held it easily in his right hand. The nobles in the galleries looked at it. Then they laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not cruel theater, but actual disbelief. A sound that said, That is not a weapon, that is a tool, that is a thing you use to open food packaging. An attendant brought Driven a Vilthari dueling saber, long, curved, made from a material that rang like a bell when it was drawn. Beautiful, ancient, made for killing exactly one kind of opponent in exactly one kind of fight. Driven stepped to the center of the floor and raised the blade in the traditional opening stance. He looked like a painting. He looked like every statue in the hall around them. Kale stepped to the center of the floor and turned the knife once in his grip, settling it where his hand knew it belonged. He had no opening stance. He simply stood feet a little wider than shoulder width, weight forward, knees slightly bent. The posture of a man who expected things to get ugly and had decided in advance that he was fine with that. The priest brought his hand down. Driven moved first, fast as water finding a crack, the saber cutting a precise arc toward Kale's left shoulder. Kale moved aside, not backward. He let the blade pass close, closer than anyone in the room expected him to allow, and stepped in rather than away. The laughter in the gallery died. It did not return. Driven was better, that was simply true. He was faster than Kale, with reflexes built over centuries of training. His reach was longer. His technique was flawless. Every cut, every step, every shift of weight was exactly what it needed to be and nothing more. He had been taught by masters, and those masters had been taught by masters before them, and the lineage of skill that lived in Driven's hands went back further than most human nations. Within the first minute of the fight, Kale had taken 2 cuts, one across his left forearm, shallow but it bled fast, one across his right side, where the blade had found the gap between 2 panels of his ceremonial robe and drawn a line of fire across his ribs. He had avoided what both strikes were aimed at, but only barely. Driven's precision was extraordinary. He did not waste motion. He did not fight with emotion. He fought the way a surgeon cuts, with calm certainty and complete control. The nobles in the galleries watched in silence. The Terran envoy had stopped breathing noticeably. The priest stood at the edge of the floor with his hands at his sides, ready to call the end the moment someone fell or yielded. The princess did not look away. She stood at her place beside the altar and watched with eyes that moved and catalogued everything, missing nothing. Driven pressed his advantage. A series of fast, precise cuts pushed Kale backward, not retreating in panic, but giving ground deliberately, staying on his feet, keeping the angle between them such that Driven could not get his full reach into the strikes. Kale parried twice with the flat of his knife, absorbing the impact of a saber against a blade a third of its length, which was deeply inadvisable, and which Driven clearly had not expected him to do. The force of it numbed Kale's hand to the wrist both times. He was learning. That was what Kale did. While other people were attacking him, while other people were winning, he was reading them. He had learned to do this because in the war, he had spent most of his time fighting enemies who were better equipped, better positioned, and better rested. You survived that by learning faster than your opponent expected. You survived by making every exchange cost them information, by making them show you what they did when their first plan failed and their second, and their third. Driven's second plan was to change rhythm. When Kale had adjusted to the speed of the initial attacks, Driven shifted, slower, deliberate, drawing him into a pattern, then suddenly fast again. It was a trained tactic, clearly effective against opponents who fought with trained responses of their own. Kale did not fight with trained responses. He fought with instinct and adjustment. The rhythm change caught him partially, Driven's blade reached his left hand, and 2 fingers folded the wrong way. He heard something snap. His hand screamed at him. He pulled it against his body and kept moving. And the gallery made a sound, a kind of sharp collective murmur, like they had not expected him to keep going. He kept going. Driven came in again, confident now, reading the injury. He aimed for the left side, the side of the broken fingers, the side where Kale's guard was compromised. It was the logical move. It was exactly what Kale had made him see, letting the injury show a little more than it needed to. At the last moment, Kale moved right instead of left. He did not try to block the saber. He accepted that the blade would reach him, calculated where it would land, and angled his body so that it caught him across the shoulder rather than the chest. He felt the cut open, deep enough to matter, not deep enough to end him, and used the momentum of that step to close the distance completely. He was inside Dreven's guard now, where the long saber was useless, where all the centuries of training in blade distance and footwork counted for almost nothing, because they had never been designed for this. This close, it was not elegant. It was not beautiful. It was not the kind of fighting that got carved into statues or recorded in training manuals. Kale hit Dreven with his elbow hard, directly into the joint of his sword arm. He drove his shoulder into Dreven's chest to break his balance. When Dreven stumbled, Kale went with him, staying close, not letting him recover the distance he needed. He took 2 more hits. Dreven was still strong and fast and trying hard, and he accepted them the way you accepted weather. Unpleasant, real, already happening, nothing to be done about it now except move through it. The saber dropped when Kale caught Dreven's wrist and applied pressure at exactly the right angle. He had learned that particular technique in his 2nd year of service from a soldier who had learned it from someone else, and it had a satisfying simplicity to it. A small movement that the human wrist could sustain, and most other joints could not ignore. Dreven went down to one knee. The hall was completely silent. Kale put the blade of his knife against the line of Dreven's throat. He was bleeding from the shoulder, the ribs, the forearm. His left hand was tucked against his chest and useless. He was breathing in the hard, controlled way of someone managing a lot of pain by choice rather than absence. He held the blade there for a moment. Then he stepped back. He lowered the knife and stepped back, putting 2 full paces between himself and Dreven, and he turned to face the rest of the hall. He looked at the galleries. He looked at 300 Velthari nobles in their beautiful clothes with their ancient jewelry and their careful, unreadable expressions. He looked at the Terran envoy, pale and gripping the railing. He looked at the priest. He looked at the princess. Then he spoke. His voice was not raised. He did not need to raise it. The hall's acoustics were 10,000 years old and flawless. "I'm not going to take his blood on a wedding day," he said. "That's not who I am, that's not what I came here to do." He paused and let that settle. "But I need every person in this room to understand something clearly because I don't want to have to do this again." He looked across the gallery slowly. "We are not here as your guests who are owed gratitude for being allowed in. We are not a footnote in your history. We are not mayflies. We are not unfinished." His voice stayed level and flat, the voice of someone saying things that were simply true. "We are here as your equals. That is what this peace means. That is the only thing it can mean, or it means nothing at all, and then every person who died in that war died for nothing on both sides." He looked down at the knife in his hand, then put it away. "I don't think either of us can afford that." No one spoke. Dreven rose slowly from his knee. He said nothing. His face was unreadable, not the careful political unreadability of before, but the real kind, the kind that meant something had happened that required time to process. The priest raised his hands. "The right of contested worth," the priest said quietly, "has been decided. The challenge is answered." He turned toward the altar. "The right of binding oaths will now continue." The hall moved again. People breathed. Attendants appeared with cloths for the blood on the floor. Kale was guided toward a small room off the main hall where 2 medical attendants were waiting. Velthari medicine was significantly better than human, and they sealed the cuts on his arm and side with something that was not quite a bandage and worked in about 30 seconds. His fingers were set and wrapped. He was given something for the pain that tasted like cold, clean water and worked considerably faster. He was brought back to the main floor looking considerably more composed than he had any right to be. The princess was standing at the altar. When he walked back to his place beside her, she looked at him the same way she had looked at him after he had told her about Meridian Station. The careful, honest, assessing look. Then so quietly that only he could hear it, she said, "You could have killed him." "Yes," Kale said. "Why didn't you?" He looked straight ahead at the priest, who was preparing to begin the rite again. "Because the point wasn't to win the fight," he said. "The point was to prove I was worth standing here." A long pause, then also very quietly, "You did." The priest began to speak. The rite of binding oaths filled the ancient hall. The light came through the high windows in long, clean columns, and the stone floor was still faintly warm underfoot, holding the memory of 10,000 years of sunlight. Kale stood straight beside the princess and listened to the words he did not fully understand, but had agreed to honor anyway. It was, he thought, a reasonable beginning. The third day of the ceremony completed without incident. Nobody laughed, nobody murmured, nobody made small, pointed comments in Old Vilthari while Kale's earpiece caught the edges of it. The nobles watched the final rituals in silence, not the cold silence of before, not the careful political silence of people choosing their moments, but a different kind. The kind that came after something had shifted and no one had quite figured out what to call it yet. When the last word of the final rite was spoken, and the priest joined their hands with a cord of braided gold and silver, the hall acknowledged it with the traditional sound. A low, resonant tone made by the gathered court, a sound that traveled through the stone of the spire and hung in the air long after the mouths that made it had closed. It was done, the treaty was sealed, they were married. Kale and the princess were separated almost immediately by the demands of the reception. She was pulled towards senior nobles who required acknowledgement. He was surrounded briefly by the Terran diplomatic team, who shook his hand too hard and spoke too fast and generally behaved like people who had spent 3 days waiting to see if everything was about to fall apart. He told them the treaty was secure. They shook his hand again. He found his coffee flask in the inner pocket of a fresh robe and drank from it slowly and let the noise of the reception move around him. Dreven did not approach him. He was present. Kale could see him in the far section of the hall, dressed still in his red robes, standing with a smaller group than usual, speaking very little. He was not the same man who had stepped forward during the rite. That man had been certain. This one was working something out. Kale did not go to him. There was nothing useful to say. What had needed to be said had been said on the floor of the spire with a blade and without one. The reception continued into the long violet evening. Food was served that Kale mostly couldn't eat. Music was played that he was slowly learning to appreciate, and the court of the Vilthari sovereignty gradually, carefully, imperceptibly began to behave slightly differently around the human in their midst. It was nothing dramatic. One noble held eye contact a moment longer than dismissal. Another inclined her head when he passed rather than looking through him. A third, an older lord with gray threading through his white hair, who had said nothing during any of it, stopped beside him at the window and stood looking out at the garden below in companionable silence for several minutes before moving on. Small things, but small things were how everything began. The royal wing was quieter than the rest of the spire. Its corridors were narrower and the stone felt older, if that was possible, smoother, worn by centuries of footsteps. The garden it opened onto was private, accessible only through 2 sets of doors that closed with a sound like a held breath, and inside it the noise of the reception was completely gone. Kale found the garden by accident. He had been looking for the room the attendants had shown him earlier and had taken a wrong turn. He stepped through the second door expecting a corridor and found himself standing in open air, under the violet sky, surrounded by flowers he did not know the names of. They were extraordinary. Some were tall and feathered, deep blue at the base, fatting to white at the tips. Some were low and small and gave off a faint silver light of their own, enough to read by if you stood close. Some grew in tight spirals and smelled like cold water and something sweet underneath it. They had been growing here, the protocol team had mentioned in passing, for 10,000 years. The garden was as old as the spire. the same plants, or the direct descendants of the same plants, that had grown here before humans had invented writing. He sat on the stone edge of a raised bed of the silver-lit flowers and looked up at the two moons and thought about a lot of things. He heard the door open behind him. He did not turn around. He already knew the sound of that particular person's footsteps. The princess came and stood a few feet away from him, looking at the same patch of sky. She had changed from the wedding robes into something simpler, the same deep silver blue as before, loose and long, her hair unbraided again. Without the full weight of the court surrounding her, she looked like herself. He was only beginning to understand what that meant, but it was already clear that the two versions were different. They stood in silence for a moment. It was not uncomfortable. That was the first thing he noticed, that the silence between them had changed from the silence of two strangers obligated to be in the same room into something that did not require filling. "I didn't know you were injured until after the rite," she said finally. "The medical report was on my desk this evening." A pause. 2 cuts requiring sealing, 3 broken fingers, bruising across the ribs and shoulder. "Could have been worse," he said. "It should have been worse," she said. "By any reading of that fight, you should not have won. Driven has trained in formal combat for over 200 years." "I know. And yet," he agreed. She sat down on the stone edge beside him, not close, but no longer the careful distance of the cabin on the ship or the cold formality of the ceremony floor, somewhere in between. "Tell me something," she said. "When you accepted the rite, when you drew your knife, were you afraid?" He thought about giving her a simpler answer. He decided against it. "Yes," he said, "I was very afraid." She looked at him. "You did not show it." "Showing it would have given him the fight before it started," he said. "Fear is real. You don't have to perform it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "In the sovereignty, to show fear before a challenge is considered deeply shameful. Nobles have forfeited legitimate rights rather than face a situation where their composure might fail." "That must cost them a lot," he said. She looked at the garden, a long pause. "My brother," she said and started again. "My brother was afraid of the war. He was a pilot. He told me once before his last deployment that he was afraid every time he sat in a cockpit. Every time. He told me it never stopped." She looked at the moons. "He flew 47 missions before his ship was destroyed in the Meridian Corridor." She said the last 2 words carefully, as though she knew they would land with weight. Cale went still. The Meridian Corridor, the stretch of space where the Battle of Meridian Station had been fought, where his unit had burned. "I didn't know the name of the pilot whose ship we recovered debris from in that battle," he said slowly. "We never found out." "I know his name," she said quietly. "I know it the way you know those faces in your photograph." They sat with that for a while. The silver flowers gave their faint, quiet light. The moons moved almost imperceptibly across the violet sky. Somewhere in the deeper part of the garden, something like a bird made a sound, 3 notes, clear and separate, and then silence again. "I have been angry at humans for a long time," she said, not with accusation, just as a fact stated plainly the way she stated most things. It was easier than being angry at the war itself. The war does not have a face. You do. "I know," he said. "I was angry at the sovereignty for a long time too." He looked at the photograph he had taken out of habit from his new robe pocket, the same old crease, the same grinning faces. "Still am some days. I think that's honest. I think pretending we're not angry is where it goes wrong. The anger is fine. It's what you do with it." She looked at the photograph for a moment, then she looked at him. "What did you do with yours?" "Came here," he said simply. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was not softer exactly, but the formality had gone out of it, the last of the ceremonial distance that had been there since the ship, since the cabin, since the gathering hall where the mockery had started. What was left was something more real and considerably more uncertain, which was, he thought, probably how it was supposed to feel at the beginning of something. "I cannot promise warmth," she said. "I told you that, I meant it." "I know. But I can promise honesty," she said. "I can promise that I will try to see you as you are, not as what is convenient to believe about your kind." A pause. "That seems like a place to begin." "It does," he said. They sat together in the garden that had stood for 10,000 years, under 2 moons and a violet sky, in the silence that had stopped needing to be filled. Not as a symbol, not as a clause in a treaty, as 2 people who had each lost something in the same war, sitting on the same stone, looking at the same stars. The next morning, the Terran diplomatic envoy sent a report back to the Confederacy Senate. It was 3 paragraphs long. The last line read, "Treaty holding, cultural adjustment ongoing. Recommend patience and continued engagement. Humans are earning the room and beginning to understand they were never as alone out here as they believed." The report was filed and acknowledged and added to a stack of many others. Most of them would never be read again. That one eventually would be.